is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, and my childhood is divided up into segments in my mind based on what house we lived in at any given time. Just before I turned 10, we moved into a farmhouse in an expanse of corn and soybean fields in west central Ohio. Our two-lane road unfurled like a black ribbon through the green, and the tar sealing the cracks in the ancient pavement would bubble and pop at the height of summer. Black and yellow argiope spiders the size of my hand lined the edges of the fields on webs bigger than I was. To say I was free range as a child doesn't quite capture it. In the summer, with the curiosity of 10 years, I would leave the house in the morning and wander for miles through the fields and farmyards and stands of trees stretching away from us, none of which belonged to us, often not returning until the afternoon. I don't really know how I'm still alive and in full use of my limbs after some of the nonsense I got myself into back then. I'm still scared of dogs after getting chased by one too many of them, and how I don't have tetanus, I'll never know. My maternal grandmother came to visit from Phoenix, Arizona that summer, one of the only times I ever got to spend time with her before she died when I was 14. She commented repeatedly about how green everything was, and having been to Arizona several times now, I imagine Ohio in the glory of July must have seemed to her like an oversaturated photograph or a Technicolor film. I did two things for the first time on that trip: played pinochle and drank coffee. Pinochle is like a much more complicated version of euchre. It was my family's game of choice, and this was the first time I was deemed capable of taking it on. My parents were teetotalers, so coffee was the social drink that accompanied any special occasion or game night throughout my childhood. Without much fanfare, coffee became part of my daily routine, a fact that infuriated my 6th grade teacher when she told my mom I was too energetic in class and found out my morning started with a cup of joe. In high school, after getting my driver's license, I claimed Wednesdays as my day for myself, and after school I would take the car and head to our local coffee shop to drink cup after cup of frankly terrible flavored coffee and write page after page of frankly terrible tragic love poems. Coffee fueled all-nighters in college and late-night heart-to-hearts in my early 20s. When I started to drink beer, coffee receded as my drink of choice, and as my lifelong insomnia worsened in my early 30s, it became restricted to a single cup in the mornings. I started there, way back at age 10 when my grandmother visited, and the ritual still keeps this beautiful drink in my daily routine. I can't have as much of it at all hours of the day and night like I once could, which in some ways makes it that much more meaningful when I do. With the modern advent of truly great coffee, the mysteries of that dark cup unfold in ever more dazzling and beguiling variety. Today, we'll learn about what happens when those mysteries intersect with chocolate and beer. In today's episode, we'll look at the use of coffee in bean-to-bar chocolate and craft beer. We'll talk with chocolate makers and brewers who use local roasts to accent their creations, and a coffee roaster who works with craft brewers and even produces their own coffee-infused bean-to-bar chocolate. We'll learn about the ecological and ethical realities that bind coffee and chocolate together in particular, and how those similarities can lead to better practices in the future. Coffee beers and coffee chocolates are everywhere. It's not hard to find great coffee beer in a craft beer bottle shop or on tap at a local brewery. And a quick search on barandcocoa.com, where I order much of my chocolate, shows 30 coffee-infused chocolate bars in their selection alone. Craft brewers began using coffee and beer sometime in the 1990s and fought to maintain the right to do so when the TTB began cracking down on the use of caffeine in alcoholic beverages. For the first 20 years or so of coffee being used in beer, pretty much all of the examples out there were porters or stouts. Porter and stout are family groups with numerous substyles beneath them, but all are characterized by some level of roastiness from the use of dark malts or grains, and that roastiness led to a natural harmony with coffee flavors. A great example would be AleSmith Speedway Stout, an imperial stout out of California that was first brewed in 1997. This 12% ABV stout has gone through changes over the years, but has remained a highly sought-after and respected beer, with special variant releases leading fans to camp out in front of the San Diego brewery to guarantee their allotment. The beer is big and intensely roasty, with the coffee character folded into the bold malt profile. And that's sort of the model coffee beers adhered to until just about 5 years ago when paler, lighter coffee beers began showing up. There's a reason coffee works so well in porters and stouts and why it was pretty much exclusively used in them for so long. And it's the same reason coffee works so well with chocolate, whether as an ingredient or a pairing. Coffee beans, dark malts, and most cacao beans are usually roasted in drum roasters, round chambers that rotate over a heat source, allowing them to be darkened without burning. This process not only darkens the color of the ingredient, but also develops flavor and aroma. The most common tasting notes for porters and stouts are varying forms of coffee and chocolate because that default roasty flavor we recognize in all three products has as much or more to do with the roasting process itself as with the inherent properties of the raw ingredients. You can think of roasted malt, coffee, and roasted cacao as a flavor triangle of sorts. There are endless flavor nuances and unique aromatics in each, but that foundational roast profile is fairly similar. This made adding coffee to beers containing these roasted malts very natural and didn't present a challenge to tasters, as the coffee merely added complexity to the beer's existing roast profile and rarely offered more than an abstract, dark roast coffee perception. A few years back, brewers started experimenting with lighter-bodied, lower-strength, paler styles as a foundation for more expressive and nuanced coffee character. A couple national brands led the way, but since then, regional and local offerings have popped up across the country. These beers use unassuming base styles such as blonde ale, cream ale, kolsch, or related easy-drinking styles as a way to showcase locally roasted coffees, with some even offering a rotating single origin or blend from their coffee partners. This new wave of paler, lighter coffee beers really allow the coffee to shine, with the beer itself providing a gentle supporting foundation, along with the occasional aid of vanilla or lactose. Perhaps the best example of this new wave of coffee beers is Wolf's Ridge Daybreak out of Columbus, Ohio. Daybreak is a 5.3% ABV cream ale brewed with local coffee. It's the brewery's best-selling beer, and it's medaled in the coffee beer category at the Great American Beer Festival, the nation's most prestigious beer competition, the last 2 years straight, winning gold in 2020. The beer instantly brings to mind a coffee shop in the morning with sunlight streaming through the windows and freshly roasted and ground coffee permeating the air. It's light, fresh, almost airy, with a subtle nuttiness anchored by the careful use of vanilla and a brightness to the coffee aroma that's hard to find in the traditional darker coffee beers, however good they might be. I talked recently with Wolf's Ridge brewmaster Chris Davison about Daybreak and about why a close relationship with a good coffee roaster is important to creating thoughtful, nuanced coffee beers. You use coffee in quite a few beers, and I think you're probably the only brewery that I can think of whose best-selling beer is a coffee beer, right? Isn't Daybreak still your bestseller?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's probably quarter to a third of our portfolio is Daybreak, which is a 5% blonde cream ale with Madagascar vanilla beans and single origin coffee from One Line Coffee in Columbus. Vanilla in general is something that I feel really passionate about, using real vanilla. I think especially playing with really good coffee, I want to use that ingredient, but it's very expensive. And then the coffee, kind of like the cacao, like I was describing, One Line Coffee does a really great job of describing their coffees and providing me information and education on the coffees, letting me taste and sample things whenever I want. Every once in a while when we're doing a special beer or if they have a new house roast, I'll come down and we'll do a cupping and taste through 20 different coffees and take notes and discuss them and whatnot, which is really eye-opening. If you've never been to a cupping, I recommend anyone go. One line, for instance, they offer a free one every Sunday to the public, and you can go in and they do 6 or 8 at a time, and you'll just see like this one smells like kiwis and then this one smells like fudge. It's really crazy to see the difference from origin to origin or roast to roast. The more I learn about coffee and appreciate coffee when I'm traveling, I'll go find little coffee roasters and taste their pour overs and their single origins and the stuff they're proud of or charging a lot for. And more often than not, I'm like, I really prefer one line coffee to what I'm tasting here. I might be a little biased, but I've been very happy with their coffee. And so they're always, complimenting us and congratulating us for the beer tasting really good or winning awards for our coffee beers. But I always like double it back on them and say, if your coffee wasn't so good, these beers wouldn't be so good. So usually Daybreak is comprised of their house roast, which is a medium roast, a single origin. Currently it's Colombia El Progreso coffee, but then that's about 2/3 of the coffee we add to the beer, and then we add about 1/3 of a light roast coffee, which is another single origin, and that one rotates in and out a lot more frequently than the house roast, the El Progreso. They'll have the house roast being usually for most of the year, but then usually at least once a year it changes, and so we have to kind of roll with the punches. But because it's their house roast, they usually try to profile it fairly similar. So we're working off a base of a more true coffee, chocolate roast notes, but not too dark in profile, and then we'll find a complementary light roast that hopefully has some like fruitier overtones. Sometimes there's like berries, strawberries, tea and things in there, but I'll also look for complementary flavors that we want to complement a true coffee or a darker coffee character like honey or bourbon or chocolate or something like that. So that's kind of how we go about selecting the coffee for Daybreak. And it's a really, really fun beer. If you've never had it, it does not look like a coffee beer, and so that's part of the fun of it. It does well at bars because of that. So, and somehow it's still outselling our flagship IPA. So it's a fun beer to have.
For a long time, felt like all coffee beers were porters and stouts. They were the darker beers that already had that roastiness.
Mm-hmm.
The last few years, we've started to see more beers like Daybreak, where that coffee flavor is just kind of sitting right out there freshly on its own. What changes for you putting coffee into a beer like that versus something like an imperial stout where you can fit that into the malt bill a little better? What changes in that process?
So usually we're putting darker roasts in bolder flavored coffees in our imperial stouts just because it's harder to stand out. We're usually not adding more coffee. It's usually just a darker roast coffee or maybe an espresso, which may not actually be like a dark roast, but an espresso roast will just stand out a little bit better. We're usually adding like about a pound per barrel. It's not a ton. I've heard of people using 3 and 4 times that. But I think part of that's just how we're adding the coffee and the way it's being extracted. Again, this will depend on the beer. We'll try to find complementary flavors. One line doesn't do a lot of dark roast, but they usually have 2 or 3. And so I'll try to find one with a profile that fits the beer it's going into. If it's a big bourbon barrel aged imperial stout, then I'll pick the one that's got these notes of like molasses and burnt sugar. And if it's our 6% milk stout, then I just want their really clean and slightly fruity house espresso. So sometimes that just depends. For Daybreak, we want that medium roast and that light roast because we don't want to overwhelm that really light, delicate beer with dark, overly roasted coffee flavors. We want it to still taste like a beer or like a light beer, but smell and taste like a smooth, kind of like iced coffee almost.
Daybreak has inspired a number of other Ohio brewers to brew similar beers, including Branch and Bone Dimmer Golden Ale, Sonder Cato Kolsch, Mad Tree Coffee Table Blonde, and Jackie O's Cool Beans Golden Ale. Those last two brewed with lactose for very subtle sweetness and a perception of creaminess. Chocolate has a similar synergy with coffee, as anyone who has enjoyed a few squares with their morning cup can attest to. Numerous chocolate makers are using coffee from local roasters in their bars, just like brewers are. These range from relatively simple concepts intended to showcase the character of a particular single origin coffee, while some others offer a more specific culinary concept. I recently spoke with Sarah Ratza of Ratza Chocolate in Tarpon Springs, Florida. You'll hear all about Sarah's chocolate in an episode in February, but for now I'll share a brief segment in which she explains the concept behind one of her most popular bars, made with coffee from Solar Roast in Colorado.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
So I get a lot of people asking for chocolate-covered espresso beans, and with the way I am in production, it's just I can't do that right now because I literally would be hand dipping each espresso bean. So the chocolate-covered espresso bean bar, the coffee bean bar, is my take on the chocolate-covered espresso beans. So it's going to have the beans inside of the bar. So they're all the whole beans. So basically you're just going to break the bar and eat them. But I try again to find the best coffee that I can find at the time that are going to go in those bars. And sometimes it changes based on whatever bean I can find. I used to use a local roaster out of Tampa, but unfortunately I haven't been able to get a hold of them recently. And when I was working at the coffee shop, it was easy because we had the beans. So the bean I've been using has been a company out of Colorado that uses solar power to roast their beans, and they have a good Peruvian bean. Peruvian's my favorite, so naturally I'm just like, oh, Peruvian, yes. So, and they have good clean beans. To me, like oily's not good, and I like light roast beans. So
Do you feel that the origin of the coffee really comes through in the chocolate, or is it more just like a general coffee flavor that you're looking for?
I feel that if you are a coffee person, you would be able to tell the difference. I think that it is important to me. If I were to eat that bar, I would be able to tell the difference in the bean that's going into that bar.
Sure.
So I also like Ethiopian coffee. I think has a really good fruity flavor that goes really well with certain bars of mine. But the Peruvian beans have always just been like with the chocolate that I'm using right now was just a really good compliment.
Maverick Chocolate out of Cincinnati, Ohio have won awards for several of their bars, and they produce multiple coffee-infused bars using coffee from local roaster Deeper Roots, whose coffee I've gotten to know through their partnership with my local coffee shop here in Greenville. I talked recently with Paul Picton, founder of Maverick, and you'll hear the rest of our conversation where we talk about Maverick's collaborations with Cincinnati area breweries in another episode soon. We talked for a while, though, about his use of coffee, and I want to share that segment with you now. Paul explains why he feels coffee and chocolate are such a natural fit together, as well as his process for collaboratively selecting beans for his chocolate with the folks at Deeper Roots.
I think coffee and chocolate are really two sides to the same coin in a lot of ways. They grow in very similar regions, in some cases even the same farms and estates. They're served basically with minimal processing. We roast the cocoa beans, we roast the coffee beans. So they both went through the Maillard process, so they're similar, I think, flavors in a lot of way. Coffee is much more intense than cocoa beans. So why when we make a drink of coffee, we pour the water over the grounds, but the grounds we dispose of because they're just too intense the way they are. Chocolate, significantly more mellow, and we take the whole bean and grind it up, and that becomes the basis of a chocolate bar. So I view them as I said, very similar. The kind of tasting notes that you can get and how those variations happen is very similar between coffee and chocolate. Growing conditions, if it's too cold, if it's too moist, the elevation, all of those things, that affect coffee, the similar issues affect chocolate. So I think there's a big reason that those pair so well together. And so for us, that was sort of a natural thing. I mean, part of that was just how we got into chocolate. I used to sell jet engines. I'm a mechanical engineer. I worked for GE and Delta for years, and I traveled around the world. And everywhere I'd go, I would bring home chocolate and coffee. Especially when I go to Europe, I'd bring home, European chocolate and several kilograms of Italian espresso. And so when I left that job, that was about 7 years ago, I'm like, well, where am I going to get, good chocolate now? So I started to make it myself, but I was always like to have a bit of chocolate with my afternoon coffee break. And that's been going on since I was in the Air Force back in my early 20s. And so to me, coffee and chocolate were always sort of a natural pairing. I grew up in Canada. We have a very wonderful chocolate bar up there called the Coffee Crisp, which, was a lightly coffeed snack that had wafers and chocolate. And I always sort of thought as coffee and chocolate as a very good pairing. So that became one of the first bars that we made once we decided to open Maverick Chocolate. We had a couple dark chocolates, milk chocolate, and then the one with espresso.
Yeah, let's talk about those individually then. The espresso one is made with deeper roots, is that right?
That is correct. So that was one of the first places that we sort of started with, and we started sort of asking around, hey, where's the best place in Cincinnati to get, freshly roasted coffee? And Deeper Roots kept showing up, and they were still quite new. This was like 7 years ago, so they had a couple year head start on us, but we got to know those guys quite well, and said, yeah, we'd like to get some kind of espresso to put into the chocolate. And again, we did a similar kind of pairing kind of thing, tried a few different chocolates, find, a few different coffees, sort of see what would work. And we end up settling on their Alchemy espresso. And that's what we use to this day. And so I think it's a nice balance. It's actually only 3% espresso beans, but we take the whole bean and throw it in the grinder along with the cocoa beans and grind them in. So we don't brew it as a coffee and then pour that in, something like that. Chocolate is oil-based, so I can't really add any kind of wet ingredients, but the whole beans work quite well. And so they grind in just like we grind in our cocoa beans. So the flavor becomes completely homogeneous into the bar. And I think by doing so, it mellows it a little bit, but it's then fully infused. So I sort of view it as the counterpoint to a chocolate covered espresso bean, which is sort of crunchy, quite a bit more, coffee and a little more caffeine kick to it. So this is sort of the opposite side to that one. It's very smooth and just a hint of coffee. And that one won the bronze medal at the International Chocolate Award a couple of years ago. So I'm pretty pleased with that collaboration.
Now, you mentioned with collaborating with the brewery, sometimes the brewer wants specific flavor notes. Sometimes they just want that sort of general chocolate flavor. When you're looking at using a coffee, are you looking at specific flavors that you're wanting from an espresso bean or another coffee bean, or do you just want that sort of general coffee flavor?
No, what I wanted a specific flavor. And really what I was looking for was more of that intensity that tends to come from an espresso roast. I didn't want, too dark, there's a whole, big argument in the coffee world of how dark is too dark, and, and complaints of charbucks and all the rest of these things. And so we wanted something that was, I think, more could, understood the flavor. And I'd spent the previous 6 years working overseas. I was in Europe every 2 weeks and had a lot of, Italian espresso, German chocolate. And so I wanted something that sort of captured more of that kind of flavor and feeling. And so, when we tried some of the other ones, again, you get a lot of different kind of notes, but what I really wanted was that to be sort of reminiscent of, sitting at a cafe with your espresso and a little bit of chocolate, and how to blend that into one bar.
And you've also done the collaboration with Ruya. Tell me a little bit about that one.
That was one where they approached us. Roya is run by a Turkish immigrant woman. She's trying to help, preserve her Turkish heritage here in America. And so she actually works with Deeper Roots to create a blend of coffee for her. And she does pop-ups of Turkish coffee. But one of the, parts of the Turkish coffee experience that, she had in Turkey was having a bit of chocolate as well. And so she approached us going, hey, can you, make a bar to my recipe? And I'm like, probably. So, what's your recipe? So she explained how she wanted it made. And again, we went through a few different batches. The key difference between that and most of the other ones we've made is Turkish chocolate has cardamom in it. And that makes, to me, a big difference. And so that little bit of that note certainly, I think, sets that off. And it's been, I think, quite popular. I think we did the pop-up 2 years ago. The first one she had at People's Liberty across from Findlay Market, and it's now grown. She does these regularly. But the chocolate has taken on a bit of life of its own. We sell it at our shops, and we sell it online. And it's become one of our better sellers. So, if someone just told me make a Turkish coffee bar, I would not have made it as good as what we came up with. So collaboration definitely is a good way to go.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing. Seventh Sun Brewing in Columbus, Ohio takes similar inspiration for one of their stouts. Seventh Sun brews several coffee beers, and perhaps the most notable is Kahwa, an imperial stout brewed with coffee from Columbus roaster Mission Coffee, as well as cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, and ginger. The spice profile is robust but not hot or overwhelming. I spoke in the fall with Seventh Sun brewmaster Colin Vent about the process of developing such a unique twist on the classic coffee imperial stout formula and how these beers actually come together at the brewery.
That's a really interesting one where that's a coffee beer, but we put a small amount of the cocoa nibs in there to just accentuate the richness of the stout itself. So it has like some roasted malt that has a little bit of the roasted barley in it, in addition to chocolate malts. And I initially included a small amount of cocoa nibs or cacao nibs to just kind of amp up the richness of that beer, knowing that we were going to be layering like a really assertive coffee and spice profile on top of it. So I just wanted to back that up with something sweet in regards to the the overall thing. There's a lot of stuff where I see what's going on in the market and I see what's really popular and all of that. And I it's like, well, we need to make an imperial coffee stout. But again, Wolf's Ridge is a great example. They make great coffee stouts. You look around and there's coffee stouts everywhere, and you can get with origin on it, and you can do this, and you can do that. And for me, it was sort of like, well, how do I take coffee stout in a different direction? And then something that you don't see a lot, that it's always been in the back of my mind. I'm not a real big coffee drinker. Actually, I don't drink coffee at all. But I've always loved, at the time I associate with this Turkish coffee, which has got cardamom and some other spices in it. And after doing some research, I found out that that's actually a little misnomer. It's actually Arabic coffee is spiced, or Turkish coffee is much closer to just Greek coffee, which is just boiled grounds. But anyway, the general population kind of thinks of that as being like Turkish coffee. So, all right, here's our opportunity to do a spice beer, and here's our opportunity to do a coffee beer all in one. Looking at someone like Jackie O's for inspiration of, like, they've done a handful of their big imperial stouts that involve some spices. But I don't see a lot of spiced coffee stouts, and there's already like a precedent for it in this style of coffee brewing. So I did some research into how those coffees are put together, their usual spice blends, and then just kind of punch that up a little bit so that it would kind of come through in that beer.
What was your base coffee for that?
That one was a medium roast from Mission. We work with Mission a lot. They're 2 doors down from us, where Fox and Stout's 3 doors down. So we have this little coffee row happening. And those guys are great to work with. I hit them up often for beans. I don't remember the origin, but it was medium roast, because they don't typically go darker than medium, and most of the stuff they do is on the lighter spectrum. And with this beer, I definitely wanted to push it more towards the roasted caramel chocolate characteristics of a darker bean, but not full into the like heavy roast full city kind of stuff. And so they've been good to work with in terms of saying, like, hey guys, here's the beer we're making. These are the kind of nuances we're looking for from the bean. What can you guys do to hit those targets? And they'll say, oh yeah, we've got this medium Brazilian. It'll be caramel and this and this and that, whatever. And it's like, that sounds great. Give me 150 pounds of that or whatever. So.
With that beer in particular, with all those spices, some of those are potentially quite volatile and could get out of control in the overall profile very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about, when you're just brewing that for the first time, balancing all of those different components that individually could be too much? Just intuition?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I cooked. So I cooked professionally for about 7 years before I got into brewing, and homebrewed a lot in those times, and used spices a lot when homebrewing. And then look at kind of what you see like from other brewers and things like that. Like one point, Westbrook posted their spice ratio for their Mexican cake stouts, which are very popular. Yeah. And we managed to drink some of those. A friend of a friend brought some in, and they were so well balanced. And it's just like, oh, these guys nailed it. Like, knowing their ratio of X cinnamon to X vanilla to X habanero, whatever, that's a good jumping off point to say, per barrel or whatever. And you're saying like, okay, here's what Westbrook's doing on cinnamon. So knowing what we know about cinnamon and its intensity, and we know how successful Westbrook was with this particular beer with their cinnamon, we can kind of start to layer things around that. And having had a lot of experience with cardamom, I know what cardamom can do in the wrong amounts. It's like, right, here's where cardamom needs to sit. It needs to be 80% of that flavor profile, but by weight, it can only be about 20% of the mix, because the stuff is just so intense. Similarly, then we layer in like it's cardamom, ginger, clove, cinnamon, coffee, and chocolate are the spices and then I think there might even just be a hint of vanilla for some roundness. But those are the main spices that go into kawa. And so it's sort of like kind of playing with the dry spices in a bowl until like getting the right aroma just from sniffing this bowl of spices. And then kind of looking back at Turkish/Arabic coffee recipes and what I know about the Westbrook thing, and just kind of playing with all of that, and then throwing that into the first pilot batch, and kind of like being pretty happy with the overall effects, and then scaling it from there. So, and again, with the recirculation thing, on the pilot, it's like a bag of spices hung in the fermenter. With the recirculating thing, you can fix it. So, if you don't quite get it on the first day, let it circulate longer. If it's too much cinnamon, not enough cardamom, and overall the effect is kind of low, put a little more cardamom in and run it again, you could tweak it if necessary. We haven't had to. It was kind of nice that we managed to land on a good general breakdown for all those spices. But in an emergency, we probably could like adjust afterwards if we had to.
What kind of cardamom are you using for that?
Whole green cardamom. Oh, that one actually also has Indian coriander in it too.
Seven Sun brews several other coffee beers as well, including Work From Home Brunch, a light-bodied 6% ABV stout released earlier in the COVID pandemic that was actually a blend of several other beers, and Lessons of Darkness, a bruising 13% ABV imperial stout brewed with cacao nibs from Ethereal Confections and coffee from Upper Cup. One thing that distinguishes many of Seven Sun's beers is the eye-catching artwork. In episode 8, I talked about the whimsical art on their Fox in the Stout, showing a fox sleeping snugly inside a realistic-looking cacao pod. Kahwa features several gorgeous renditions of falcons or hawks. Falconry is still practiced in the Middle East, and here Colin explains the artist who conceived these intriguing depictions and the meaning behind them.
His name's Will Fugman. He's professional illustrator by trade. He's really good friends with the ownership here at the brewery. They've known each other for 10 years or something crazy like that, 20 years. When we were first starting this place, like in the kickstartering phases even, he did some mock-ups for art for us back in the day for Black Sheep Stout and the Seven Sun Strong Ale. And there were just these interesting little, kind of tableaus that he did for us. And we never worked with him after. He just drew these things for us. They were great, but we didn't use them. We ended up going a much more graphic route with our first kind of early releases. And then we started bottling and used a tattoo artist. And then we switched to a local painter. And then we went to a different illustrator. And then we finally settled on Will again. We kind of got back in touch with Will and why haven't we actually used him for anything? And we started working with him, and it was just sort of like this breath of fresh air to finally be working with someone who is an illustrator by trade and understands banging out these pieces of amazing art in a week and a half on deadline and being like, hey, here's 3 variations on this. This is kind of what I was thinking about it, whatever. And I usually will give him the name, the style of beer, and kind of my general inspiration behind putting the recipe together and the name. So like kawa, for instance, the word kawa is the original Arabic word for coffee. So the word coffee, cafe, all the different world ways of saying coffee go back to the word kawa. That's the original word for the beverage made out of coffee beans. And so I told Will this. I was like, hey, it's based on Arabic coffee and it's the original word, blah, blah. And then he comes back, he's like, oh, that's great. I lived in Saudi Arabia for years when my dad was in the military, and I went to all these crazy markets selling coffee all the time. And there was these guys that would have hawks. Can I put a hawk on the label? I was like, yeah, that's awesome. There's no connection between hawk and coffee bean in normal life, but for the guy that's illustrating this can, he has this really visceral childhood memory of hawks in this open air market and these dudes selling coffee in Saudi Arabia, where historically this drink originated. So it's kind of that was a really happy thing to just kind of come back around. And it's the artwork just sort of almost was already there, and then Fox in the Stout was a little more literal, or where Will literally drew a fox curled up inside of a big, cocoa pod. When we first started working with Will, and he's done dozens and dozens of can labels for us by now and bottle labels prior to that. We were like, hey, Will, will you do art for us? We really don't care what it looks like. Pick a thing and make us some great art. And he's like, here's what I'm thinking. I want to do sort of these old sepia tone naturalist illustrations like Audubon and things like that you'd find in, natural history museums, but sort of skew them a little bit unnatural, unnerving, a little into the weird. And that's kind of where some of this stuff came from. Kawa was one of the first ones that he did that was just straight up realistic.
Last question then. You don't drink coffee, you make all these coffee beers.
Yeah.
What do you think of these beers, and why does coffee seem to continue to be a muse for you when you don't actually drink it much?
I don't know. It's weird. As much as I don't sit around chewing on malt much either. It's sort of I don't Crystal 90 or Simpson's Crystal Dark is one of my favorite malts, but I don't really snack on it. It's just something that I know that hey, this thing is delicious when you put it into beer, and it achieves a lot of the goals that I have for particular recipes. And I think that for me, the coffee thing is like, there's so many people that are really, really good at coffee. You got all these roasters that are getting green beans all over the world, and they roast them into these really interesting profiles, and they know 1,000 times more about it than I do. So I almost like enjoy deferring to their expertise in that, hey, we're going to make a beer. I want to put coffee in it because I like what coffee does in beer. But beyond that, I'm going to rely on this expert to say, what bean do you think is going to be like really cool in this beer? I'll say, this is the inspiration for the beer. I was hoping to get a coffee that's sort of caramel forward. And they're like, cool, we have this one. It tastes like brownie batter, caramel, and raspberries. I'm like, sweet, let's put that into the beer. It sounds great. And with as nerdy and obsessive as I can get with certain things, I don't want to go down another rabbit hole of something else I need to know a lot about. Yeah. So for me, it's much more like I love working with coffee the way I like working with hops. I can smell the coffee. I smell the interesting things in the coffee. The way it's grown and the way it's processed is something I'm going to leave to somebody else and let them like have their expertise at it. And I just want this really great finished product that I can put into my beer and make my beer taste better to achieve some goal.
Now that we've talked to chocolate makers and brewers, let's hear directly from some coffee experts. Onyx Coffee Lab is roasting fantastic beans at their Arkansas roastery, and they've partnered with numerous craft breweries, including Burial Beer, Ozark Beer, and Fossil Cove Brewing, and bean-to-bar chocolate makers Markham and Fitz.
I think overall, we're telling the story of the coffee industry. If I had to pick one thing, and I know that's kind of broad and that's all-encompassing, but my wife, who's my other partner in the company, we both grew up as baristas, and the goal of Onyx was to, and still is, it was to start a roasting company whose, whatever word you want to use, demographic, our target was the coffee industry to begin with. We wanted coffee for people like us. Our focus is basically always on like, what do baristas think of our coffee?
That's John Allen, who founded Onyx Coffee Lab with his wife, Andrea, in 2012. John is the chief green coffee buyer at Onyx, meaning he's responsible for sourcing the raw coffee his company will roast, and he spends about 4 months of every year traveling to Origin to source the best possible coffee. While John has long known coffee and chocolate were natural partners, Onyx has moved in recent years to bring these two tropical crops into closer harmony under the roastery's roof.
In the cacao and the chocolate side of things, the story I would like to tell is that it's just beginning. People, I think for the longest time, have just seen chocolate as a treat that is cheap and indulgent. But honestly, there's so much more complexity to it.
That's Preston Stewart, who joined Onyx recently after years at Arkansas bean-to-bar chocolate maker Markham and Fitz. Preston is now Onyx's chief chocolate officer, and he has exciting plans for the future of chocolate and coffee at Onyx. I sat down recently with John and Preston to talk about the use of their beans in craft beer and bean-to-bar chocolate. They were talking with me from their roastery, and the sounds of the cafe and the work of producing great coffee can be heard in the background. So try to imagine COVID doesn't exist, and you're sitting in a well-lit coffee shop listening in on this conversation. I started by asking John about the change we've seen in coffee beer from the older model of big stouts to the newer, lighter beers that allow for more coffee nuance, and how he feels about the importance of coffee selection when brewing one of these beers.
Yeah, they matter quite a bit. I mean, I think you're right with the history, and I think to some extent it can still be that way, especially for some of those dark, thicker, heavier beers that for coffee, most high-end specialty coffee, we're talking about such nuanced flavors, and normally they're on the delicate, very light roasted side, that those tend to get lost, basically if they're used with anything. So what I would think of as like the really high scoring sort of purest, expensive coffees out there don't work that well for basically any confectionery or beer. Mm-hmm. But that being said, you do want to look, like for instance with stouts and things like that, we start to look for very dense coffees that have high moisture content, high sugar content, that we can really try to develop a lot of caramelization within the roaster. And so you tend to see more developed roast or a longer roast time. Tend to look for varieties that are much denser. So you wouldn't use, there's certain varieties of coffee like Pacamaras or some Bourbones that are these types of varieties that are very porous and very soft and can take some of the development within the roaster. And only recently have we really started seeing naturally processed coffees and more East Africans pop into coffee beers, and that tends to be coffee IPAs, which we're starting to get a lot more requests about, basically because people are looking to do as much acid and as much fruit as they can in these beers.
A brief note on the IPAs John is talking about. IPA is a family of beers that derive the majority of their character from hops. Hops are flowers that resemble small, leafy green pine cones, and they're the primary seasoning agent in beer, providing both bitterness in the form of alpha acids and a wide array of flavors and aromas from their essential oils, including fruity and floral notes. Until recently, IPAs weren't looked at as great candidates for brewing with coffee, but when handled properly, there can actually be some subtle harmonies between hop character and fresh, acidic coffee beans. I asked John about the types of coffees he's seeing used in these beers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen it kind of go in two ways. One is like a light roasted sort of Kenya coffee tends to result in a lot of like high citric acid, high malic acid, a lot of grapefruit kind of notes. And so they'll sort of try to, in my opinion, sort of like double up on a lot of the flavors of the hoppiness, minus a bit of like maybe some pine and things. Or look to accentuate it with these kind of like cherry berry notes, and I think they round out pretty well. I mean, I still think that the coffee tends to get lost. I'm probably like, it would be probably better to talk to a brewer about it because I'm always going to be a little bit on the coffee side and think like, I wish this was a little more coffee forward. But I have been pleasantly surprised with how it's really turned out, and it's been interesting to see the application process on different brewers and how they use the coffee to begin with, whether it's brewing a cold brew or some sort of like high extraction yield concentrate versus putting whole beans in a mash tank versus ground kind of tea bag system. I don't know, I find all that a little bit interesting.
So looking at the actual flavor then that comes through, beyond just the way that those coffee flavors interact with something like hop flavor or malt flavor in the beer, do you notice when you taste a particular bean in the finished beer, does it come through pretty directly from what you know of that bean? Like, in other words, if you were to brew a cup of that coffee, would you recognize the same flavors in the beer, or does it alter in some way through that process?
It does alter, but it is recognizable, but I think only if it is what you could already say is like a standout recognizable coffee. So again, like some of those fruit forwards, anything that to me is processed naturally. So if the coffee is dried within the cherry or the fruit itself, and you get a bit more fermentation, those coffees tend to speak just because they're also more unique and pungent and flavor. I think when we're talking about traditional Central Americans roasted, what most people would call like a medium or dark roast, those can start to get lost, and you get the nuance of sort of what you were talking about. You get this coffee flavor, almost the flavor of coffee instead of like singling out these notes, but it becomes a little bit unrecognizable at that point.
Sure.
And to me, it's just another flavor component or ingredient.
To demonstrate the significance of coffee origin on the flavor of coffee beer, Cincinnati's Mad Tree Brewing last winter released a 4-pack of their local blend coffee porter brewed with lactose, and each of the 4 cans featured a different coffee from each of Ohio's 4 largest metro areas: Dayton, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. Tasting these beers side by side was eye-opening. The Dayton batch was brewed with washed Kenyan Kifahari beans from Boston Stoker and had a really warm spice presentation in the aroma, led by cinnamon and fresh, earthy jalapeno, with woody and honey-like notes beneath. The flavor had spiced milk chocolate with elements of cardamom, cinnamon, and other curry spices, as well as a light acidic red berry and some mild sweetness. The lactose in these beers provides a nice, gently sweet foundation for these flavors to really pop. The Cincinnati batch was brewed with dry processed Panama beans from deeper roots. This one had a deep, funky earthiness that I really enjoyed. Aromas of red wine barrel, overripe Concord grapes, and fresh pepper led to earthy, foresty flavors. I had the impression of being deep in the woods in the summer, that comforting, spicy green funk of soil, wood, and leaf litter, along with dark fudge and, finally, gentle strawberries and cream. Robust but smooth, this was the most complex of the 4 versions. The Cleveland batch was brewed with dry process Ethiopia Kasagesha beans from Phoenix Coffee. Combined with the added lactose, this led with smooth milk chocolate, followed by gentle woodiness and some subtle overripe forest fruit. Pawpaw came to mind. This was probably the cleanest and mildest of the 4 variants, with just a gentle pawpaw-like acidity on the finish. Restrained but lovely. The State Capital Edition from Columbus was brewed with washed Guatemalan Nahuala beans from Stouf's Coffee. Of the 4 variants, this one had the purest expression of what we think of abstractly as coffee. It made me think of walking into a coffee shop while the beans are being ground. Along with the lactose, this one gave me the nostalgic impression of the flavored coffees that got me into coffee 2 decades ago. Caramel, toffee, hazelnut, with just a bit of lemon zest acidity. This led to perceiving this as the sweetest of the 4, though they're the same base beer and have the same actual amount of residual sugar content. Roast does matter when selecting beans for coffee beers, but it takes careful sensory selection and the right base beer to allow these nuances to really sing in the finished beer. On the chocolate side, Onyx is interested in how the terroir of origins for both cacao and coffee can lead to fascinating pairings between them, and more importantly, how these crops being grown together can lead to better ecological practices in farming and better income stability for the farmers.
Yes, so we worked with Markham and Fitz on a mocha bar that was really fun, and then we actually had a kind of our own project. It's been running for around 3 or 4 years now called Terroir, where we were actually making bean to bar coffee bars with pairing basically the same origin of coffee to the same origin of cacao.
Oh, wow.
And it's sort of a larger blanket project where basically we're trying to source other commodities that coffee farmers are growing to create kind of like year-round cash flow instead of just a single harvest. And also try to better use some of the agronomy on the farm level. So lower elevations, for instance, on the farm, that would be great for cacao, but probably produce commodity level coffee is not really rewarding. So kind of like trying to diversify some of these crops within there. So that project as a whole, which is, you know, honey and vanilla and cacao and obviously coffee and things like that, is sort of a bean to bar program, but has sort of wavered on and off as it gets some attention from Onyx and some not, I would say, over the years. But we hope to kind of bring that back strong with Preston, actually.
Did you notice any consistencies at all in the way that regional differences shifted with both coffee and cacao? I mean, is there any direct analogies between the two of the way that the differences of microclimate and all that affected those 2 crops?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not a real expert on cacao, so this would be my best guess on some of these things. But I do think for farms that have diversified crops like that I visited, I think some of the techniques are really interesting. I mean, definitely terroir has, I would think, some nuance within the flavors there, even if it's just, amount of phosphorus pulled from the same soil or, the same cultural practices, I think, have a big aspect, but also fermentation techniques and processing and all of these things that are done by the same family or same group that have such a big impact on flavor, I do think tend to spill over to each other. So while, you may not have the exact same notes within the coffee or within the chocolate, there are sort of like synergistic like cohesions, I think, between the crops. So from that standpoint, I think big time, my hope is to explore it a lot more in the future and in that sense, get a better understanding of the market, but the cacao market,
Yeah.
at least with the producers we work with, is usually a very small or side project of what they're doing at this point and not a viable sort of income. And so that has been a bit of a difficult side because we're sort of like trying to launch a concept, but at the same time needs to be justifiable on their end. And so we have sort of yet to fully prove the concept, but hopefully we can kind of resolve that when these travel bans lift, you know?
Oh yeah, I was just going to agree with John that like the potential of realizing that synergy is something that we're looking forward to. And cacao farms a few different times and seeing just the natural cooperation that cacao and coffee have in terms of cacao being more of a tree, coffee being more of a shrub, often like shade, like the fact that they live together in the wild when planted with some biodiversity. It makes sense from a agronomy standpoint, but also we're excited to try to flesh that out a little bit more from a economics and like helping the supply chains.
Yeah, from a standpoint of ecology and agronomy, what is gained for a farmer to be able to grow these crops together?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have biodiversity, you're going to have better soil care, right away, because the style of farming of planting, this shrub, 3 feet apart in a semicircle and planting 20 hectares of this or whatever the size of the farm is going to continue to strip the exact same resources out and therefore require, more fertilization. And the more fertilization you require, then, it can topple on to more bugs or fungicide needing to be sprayed or all sorts of things just kind of like steamroll when you have one single variety planted, multiple times. So from that aspect alone, I think you could see some help there. I think elevation is more what I'm interested in because we are buying, Onyx buys what we call 86 plus coffee, or like high-end specialty coffee. We're wanting to find a way to, sort of create better income gaps that are there with the lower elevation coffees that are never going to cup, theoretically at least, not cup very well, or unless, a harvest hits the lottery. And will end up being inevitably sold either at the local market for 5% of what they could be worth, or sold on the commodity market, which is always an unknown, just because there is no premium attached to the cupping score of those coffees. So I would say that initial income disparity could help be resolved with a different crop planted. And then I think also cash flow purposes, which is actually probably a bigger issue, I think, with at least a lot of coffee producers you would talk to, is just not having one major harvest and then expecting someone to responsibly handle the payment of that harvest for the next year as they try to juggle. I mean, I definitely can't take one paycheck a year and be responsible with it. So, the idea to have these multiple things, and I think terroir as a whole, holistically, the concept is to have, apiaries and grow some very low elevation vanilla bean, and then, sort of middle elevation cacao, and then high varieties up top, and sort of have this every 3-month kind of harvest concept.
So across the entire range that cacao and coffee are grown in, would it theoretically be possible for these to be grown together, or are there places where cacao would make sense and coffee wouldn't, or vice versa?
On the cacao side, since it's not as elevation dependent for specialty, like there may be a lot of countries near the equator in that 20 degrees north and south of the equator, that's kind of the tropical magical world where coffee and cacao thrive. There's probably more possibility for specialty cacao, whereas specialty coffee needs some elevation in certain countries, maybe like Madagascar, the Dominican Republic, or places where there's high quality cacao. They may not have the topographical potential for coffee.
Well, let's look at the labor side of this. Obviously, there's been a lot of attention within the world of chocolate on labor abuses and the importance of ethical sourcing for that. I'm not as familiar with coffee, although I know there has been a little bit of discussion around that. Can one of you speak to the ways that concerns about the ethics of labor and the supply chain for both of those intersect?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about the coffee side. I mean, it's definitely a big issue. You know, coffee is a major commodity, you know, traded for hundreds of years, and basically for something so large that is the rise and fall of so many economies, it's amazing how very little has changed, you know, in decades and decades of trading coffee. I mean, I joke when I talk about, I teach coffee sourcing classes and things like that, and I joke that it's like basically the Wild West in coffee. Even to this day, you know, there basically are no rules. And so you have obviously certain certifications that help try to mitigate or subsidize certain amounts of coffee. But the data on those certifications are very fuzzy. Usually it's more of a marketing term in the West and less of a truly data-driven financial repercussion back at origin. Not always, but I would say for the most part. And then lots of marketing terms like direct trade and basically any trade you can think of with like a really fluffy name in front of it to make people feel better about how the coffee was purchased. But yeah, the labor in coffee is super suspect all the time, to be honest, because there are so many people within the supply chain of coffee that it's very hard to get data back. It doesn't even mean that everyone is unethical within the chain. It just means that it's so hard to trace back to how things are really going. Because for many farmers, growing coffee is not their main job. It may be that they own some land, then coffee grows naturally on it, or it's grown there for 3 or 4 generations and they harvest it when it's ripe. But, you know, they may be a mechanic or a school teacher, you know, the same way I grow tomatoes in my backyard, right? So that is very common, and that's why you get a lot of homogenization in coffee, right? You have 10,000 small farmers in Yirgacheffe, Ethiopia, pooling their coffees together into one big processing mill, and then it's graded from that mill. But because you're only selling the cherry, the fruit, you're not really selling a final product. So the pay structure of, you know, the price per kilo of coffee cherry is unbelievably low, which really has, you know, a lot of repercussions because each country has a different mode of selling and valuing coffee. There is no unified understanding to say, like, you know, an 80-point coffee is going to cost this, and an 81 is this, and an 82 is this, and so forth. There's not a scale you can really move on. And so, you know, what seems fair in one country might be completely ripping off someone in another based on socioeconomics. So it is a very difficult task that no one has really totally figured out. I think from, you know, to pump the Onyx train, like our main way, not around this, but to, I guess, hit it head on is just to publish all our prices. So everything we buy, we publish the price of the contract, the price to move the container to the United States, you know, everything that we do in the chain of financial for purchasing coffee is just published out there. And that way, one, it keeps us accountable, and two, it also gives value to other producers so they can see what we're paying for really nice coffees. And I think it becomes a tool for other buyers or importers to use.
It's tied to the Q score, which is something that's a thing in coffee that's not really a thing in cacao. And so that's one place where the cacao world is learning and trying to catch up.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, do you feel like looking at these two commodity crops that one is doing better or is a little farther ahead in how they're addressing these issues that the other could learn from?
I think from a industry standpoint, cacao is probably lagging in terms of its general acceptance by society at large as something other than a cheap commodity. People are, I would say, more generally accepting of what you would maybe call third wave coffee, and there's like third wave chocolate is still a fledgling industry that is trying to gain some recognition and notoriety and acceptance as a whole.
If you want to hear more about the ethics of coffee sourcing, I encourage you to listen to Ashley Rodriguez's interview with Vava Angweni in her excellent Boss Barista podcast. I'll link to that in the show notes. The Colombia edition of Onyx's Terroir project was made with cacao from the Tumaco region, sourced by Uncommon Cacao, and coffee from Aponte village. The bar itself has a rippled, overlapping pattern of what could be leaves or could be cacao pods, but what struck me more as two ropes braided together, like the separate cords of coffee and cacao. The experience of tasting this bar was both exciting and a bit humbling. I went through my tasting process and wrote down my tasting notes and was pretty confident I knew which flavors were coming from which fruit. After I was done, I looked at the notes Preston had sent me about the bar and discovered I had so many of these sensory details reversed from the smooth and comforting cacao and the bright and expressive coffee. The bar showcases a beautiful interplay between the more acidic, fruity, and floral notes and the deeper nutty and woody tones with caramel and bourbon barrel. There's an upfront nuttiness from the coffee, but after that the balance between the higher notes of wildflowers and creamy, sweet tropical fruits and the bar's deeper, warmer comforts is seamless and beguiling. What a beautiful alchemy of these two crops. I've had the chance to try Onyx coffee in a couple beers, including Burial Beer's I Was Particles Among the Sky and My Existence Became Nevermore, which was featured way back in episode 3 of this podcast. Along with the Terroir bar, Preston sent me a version of Ozark Beer's Cream Stout made with Onyx Cold Brew, a blend of Colombian and Ethiopian beans. Tasting the base version and the coffee version side by side, I was intrigued by the way the bright, mildly spicy coffee notes seemed to lighten up the Onyx variant, while maintaining the base version's gentleness. The coffee tugs at the mild acidity of the roasted malt in the beer to create a compelling daylight connection in this 5.3% ABV beer. The Fossil Cove Coffee IPA, brewed with Onyx's Ethiopian Bombay natural process coffee, is a lesson in subtlety, with the coffee providing a quiet accent to the bolder hops. The aroma leads with sweet orange and overripe strawberry, and some quiet, fresh coffee underneath. The flavor shows the coffee in a supporting role, providing a distant toastiness or nuttiness and perhaps some supporting citrus zest to the fuller citrus character of the hops. The beer is dry with moderately high bitterness. While the coffee isn't as front and center here as in many coffee beers, this does showcase the versatility of coffee as a flavoring ingredient in brewing. There are countless great coffee beers out there worth checking out, from big stouts like Brazos Valley Slippin' Into Darkness, brewed with jet fuel coffee from Independence Coffee Company, to elegant sour ales like New Belgium Exquisite Extraction, brewed with coffee from Black and White Roasters. One of my favorites I had recently was Humble Forager Sugar Shack Diaries, brewed with Mostra coffee. All three of those beers are also brewed with cacao, further highlighting the harmony between these three diverse flavor worlds. And there are tons of great coffee chocolate bars out there as well. I've recently had lovely examples from Mission, Belvie, Definite, Manoa, and Tales, among others. If you've enjoyed good coffee beers or coffee bars recently, I'd love to hear about them. Indulge me on one quick side story about coffee aroma that I think is worth mentioning. You've probably heard of skunky or skunked beer before. While many casual drinkers use this term to denote any beer they think doesn't taste right, skunkiness is actually a specific off flavor we refer to as light struck. When beer is exposed to direct sunlight or even fluorescent lighting, UV light interacts with a compound in the hops to create a new compound called 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol, which is chemically very similar to actual skunk musk. It really does smell like a skunk. Delightful, right? This is why it's important to keep beer out of direct sunlight. What's interesting, though, is that there are no skunks in Europe, so European beer drinkers have no reference for what they smell like. Because of this, light-struck aromas in beers are sometimes identified by European drinkers as coffee. Sounds weird, right? I certainly don't think of coffee as smelling like skunk, but they can be closer together than you might think. To drive this point home, Master Cicerone Neil Whitty recently told me a story about driving with his 10-year-old son in the car. They passed a skunk, and Neil instantly got that telltale pungent whiff. He asked his son if he smelled it, and the boy answered no. A couple minutes later, though, his son spoke up from the back seat to say that this car suddenly smelled like Neil's morning coffee. Our noses and brains are wild. I often pick up green pepper or even mild jalapeno from fresh coffee beans, and there are actually some aromatic compounds they have in common. In nature, as in sensory science, nothing ever really exists in isolation. It's all a beautiful, tangled web, and beer, coffee, and chocolate are just 3 of its threads. You can learn more about my guests, Chris, Sarah, Colin, Preston, and John, in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.